You've been trained to forget this part of history.
In 1992, Los Angeles experienced one of the worst urban riots in American history. For 6 days, the city was gripped by violence, fire, and anger. These events were triggered by deep frustrations and a sense of injustice. The riot began after 4 police officers were found not guilty in the beating of a black man named Rodney King, despite the incident being caught on video for the world to see. In this video, we will explain the events that led up to the riots, walk through each day of unrest, and discuss the outcomes and consequences that followed. Los Angeles in the early 90s was a city with many problems. In some neighborhoods, especially South Central, unemployment was extremely high. In some areas, about half the people didn't have jobs. A serious drug epidemic, crack cocaine, and gang violence made daily life dangerous for many families. People in these communities felt behind and mistreated. There was a lot of poverty, and opportunities for young people were limited. The difficult situations created anger and frustration among residents even before the riot. Another major source of tension was the relationship between the Los Angeles Police Department and minority communities, especially Black and Latino residents. For many years, Black people in Los Angeles had complained that the police were treating them unfairly and often used too much force. In the 80s, the LAPD, led by Chief Daryl Gates, launched Operation Hammer, a harsh crackdown targeting gang violence. During those years, police officers swept through minority neighborhoods and arrested thousands of young Black and Latino men. Many people felt these raids were racially motivated, since officers often stopped people for no good reason other than their race. A government inquiry called the Christopher Commission in 1991 found that the significant number of LAPD officers repeatedly used excessive force and ignored the rules, and that bias and racism played a role in how some officers behaved. People of color in LA did not feel protected by police. Instead, they often felt afraid of them. At the same time, there were growing tensions between Black communities and Korean American store owners. In Los Angeles, during the 80s, many Korean immigrants had opened small businesses, like grocery stores and liquor stores in South Central. And mostly Black and Latino areas, these stores were often the closest places for local residents to shop. However, cultural misunderstandings and economic pressures led to mistrust on both sides. Many Korean shopkeepers were wary of theft and believed some customers might shoplift from them. They sometimes treated Black youth with suspicion. On the other hand, many Black customers felt disrespected or watched unfairly by Korean store owners. The two groups did not fully understand each other's language or culture, which made things worse. In 1991, this mutual resentment had been simmering for a while, creating a volatile situation. One event that lit the fuse for the 1992 riots was the beating of Rodney King. Rodney King was a 25-year-old African-American man. On March 3, 1991, he was driving in Los Angeles when police officers tried to pull him over for speeding. After a high-speed chase, King was finally stopped by LAPD officers, and what happened next would shock the nation. A nearby resident named George Holliday witnessed the scene and began recording with his video camera. The video footage showed 4 white LAPD officers surrounding Rodney King, who was unarmed. The officers knocked him to the ground and then repeatedly beat him with their batons, even when King was not resisting. In the video, King can be seen on the ground while officers hit him over and over again. They struck him dozens of times. He also suffered kicks and stun gun shocks. By the time they stopped, King had been beaten badly. The George Holliday video of the beating was soon broadcast on TV stations across the country. Millions of Americans saw with their own eyes what looked like an extreme and unjustified use of force by police. For the Black community in Los Angeles, this video was proof of what they had been saying for years, that some police officers were brutal and racist. People were outraged and demanded justice. The 4 officers involved, Stacy Kuhn, Lawrence Powell, Timothy Wind, and Theodore, were charged with assault and excessive force. However, the trial was moved out of Los Angeles to a suburban court in Valley, a community seen as a more favorable place to police. The jury in this case had no Black members. On April 29, 1992, more than a year after the beating, the verdict in the Rodney King trial was announced. The jury acquitted the officers on all charges. In other words, the officers were found not guilty, effectively clearing them of wrongdoing in the beating of Rodney King. When this news came out, it was like a spark was lit in a room full of gasoline. The Black community and others who had followed the case were shocked, hurt, and enraged. They had seen the video of King being beaten, and yet the justice system seemed to say that no one would be punished for it. The stage was set for an explosion of anger. Another key event that fueled the anger in Los Angeles was the tragic death of Latasha Harlins. Latasha Harlins was a 15-year-old African-American girl. Less than 2 weeks after the Rodney King beating, on March 16, 1991, Latasha went to a small neighborhood store called Empire Liquor in South Central Los Angeles to buy a bottle of orange juice. The store was owned by a Korean-American woman named Soon Ja-do. An argument broke out between Latasha and the store owner. Do thought Latasha was trying to steal the $1.79 bottle of juice because she saw Latasha put it in her backpack. In reality, Latasha had money in her hand to pay for the juice. She wasn't stealing. The situation escalated quickly. Latasha and the store owner got into a physical scuffle. Latasha punched Do, and Do fell behind the counter. Latasha then backed away. At that moment, Soon Ja-do picked up a handgun from under her counter. As Latasha turned to leave, Do shot the 15-year-old in the back of the head, killing her instantly. This horrifying incident was caught on the store's security camera. The community was outraged that a teenager's life was taken over a misunderstanding and a bottle of juice.
But is sentenced only to parole and a small fine. The Black community is outraged and remembers.
What, 6 months probation?
Soon Ja-do was arrested and eventually convicted of voluntary manslaughter, which normally would mean that she would do 16 years in prison. Even the jury in her trial recommended a stiff prison sentence for the crime. However, in November 1991, the judge in the case, Joyce Carlin, made a highly controversial decision. He sentenced Soon Ja-do to 0 time in jail. Instead, got 5 years of probation, 400 hours of community service, and a $500 fine. In other words, she would not spend a single day in prison for shooting a Black girl in the back of the head. Many people in the Black community were devastated and furious at this outcome. To them, it felt like the life of a young Black girl had been valued at only $500, and that the justice system did not care about their lives. The killing of Latasha Harlins severely damaged relations between Black and Korean communities in Los Angeles. Black residents saw the light punishment as a sign that even when one of their children was shot dead, justice was not served. Many were also angry at Korean store owners in general, feeling that some of them looked down on Black customers and were quick to use violence. Many Korean American store owners were frightened by threats and boycotts after the incident. Some felt they were not protected by the police from crimes like shoplifting or robbery, leading them to take matters into their own hands. The Latasha Harlins case became a painful symbol of racial tension. It happened just a year before the riots, and that anger was still fresh in 1992. In fact, just a week before the riots, appeals court upheld the judge's sentencing decision, reminding the community of the injustice. By April 29, 1992, all of these tensions, years of economic hardship, trouble, police-community relations, and the recent wounds of the Rodney King and Latasha Harlins case had built up like dry wood. The not guilty verdict for the police officers in the Rodney King beating were the match that ignited this pile. What followed was 6 days of chaos and violence in Los Angeles. We will now go through day by day to see how the unrest folded. On day number 1, the verdict in the Rodney King case came out around 3:15 p.m. on April 29, 1992. Within hours, the anger in the street was palpable. Protests began at the Los Angeles County Courthouse and police headquarters downtown, where people gathered to shout their frustration. Some chanted, "No justice, no peace," expressing that without justice, they refused to be calm. But the anger quickly spread beyond peaceful protests. In South Central Los Angeles, not far from where Latasha Harlins was killed, trouble was breaking out. By late afternoon, around 5:30, violence erupted at the intersection of Florence Avenue and Normandy in South Central. This area became ground zero for the riots. A crowd of furious locals took to the streets and began attacking passing cars and people at random. Stores were vandalized and looted, and the fires were set in nearby businesses. The police on scene were overwhelmed by the sudden violence, and shockingly, they retreated from the intersection, effectively leaving the area uncontrolled. The lack of police presence in the crowd even more. One of the most infamous moments of day 1, captured live on news helicopters, was the beating of Reginald Denny. Denny was a white truck driver who unknowingly drove into the unrest in Normandy. Rioters pulled Denny from his truck's cab and savagely beat him on the street, in broad daylight and on live television. He was hit in the head with concrete cinder blocks and kicked until he lay bleeding. Thankfully, Denny's life was saved when brave locals, strangers who saw the attack on TV, rushed to the scene to help him. The televised image of this innocent man being beaten became one of the most haunting symbols of the riot, as powerful in people's minds as the Rodney King video. Denny was not the only victim. Many other motorists were also attacked in the area as the chaos spread. Night fell on April 29th. Los Angeles was burning. Plumes of smoke rose over the city's skyline. Los Angeles Mayor Tom Bradley, the city's first black mayor, went on TV to plead for calm, but he also shared the communities by calling the verdict senseless and an injustice. Governor Pete Wilson declared a state of emergency, and by late that night, he announced he was sending in the California National Guard to help restore order. However, activating the Guard takes time. Initially, only small numbers could mobilize that night. The first day of the riots ended with widespread destruction in South Central and a tense dread about what the next day would bring. Day 2. By the morning of Thursday, April 30th, the unrest had spread far beyond the initial flashpoint. What started in South Central Los Angeles the day before exploded across many neighborhoods in LA. Looting and arson were reported in areas as far as North Hollywood and the San Fernando Valley, as far south as Long Beach. However, South Central LA and the surrounding communities like Koreatown and Pico Union were still the hardest hit. Dozens of buildings were now on fire at the same time. Thick black smoke filled the sky, visible for miles. Firefighters were working around the clock to put out the blazes, but it was very dangerous for them. In some cases, firefighters came under attack by people with guns and other objects being thrown at them as they tried to do their jobs. This shows how chaotic the situation had become. Even those trying to help, like firefighters, were not safe. With the police force stretched thin and often nowhere to be seen, some local citizens took up arms to protect their property. In many places, especially Koreatown, Korean American business owners decided they could no longer rely on the non-existent police response. They organized themselves into small armed groups to defend their shops and families. Some stood on rooftops with rifles or handguns, earning the nickname Rooftop Koreans. They exchanged gunfire with armed looters in the streets below. While this self-defense likely protected some stores from being destroyed, it also added to the sense that Los Angeles was like a war zone. Looting was rampant across many parts of the city. People were breaking windows and taking goods from electronic stores, supermarkets, clothing shops, any place where the owners had fled. There was a sense of lawlessness. Some opportunists took advantage of the chaos for personal gain, while others said they were expressing rage against the system they felt oppressed them. More National Guard troops arrived in the city as the day went on. Eventually, 4,000 National Guardsmen would be deployed by the end of the riots. By day 3, the sheer scale of the destruction and violence was finally starting to bring overwhelming force from authorities. By this day, about 6,000 California National Guardsmen were on the ground in Los Angeles, patrolling alongside police. Armed soldiers in fatigues and Humvees became a common sight on the city streets, especially around the areas that had been hit the hardest by heavy looting. They guarded important intersections and stood in front of shops to deter rioters. Peace was gradually being restored by patrols, but sporadic violence continued. There were still reports of shootings, burglaries, and arson. On that Friday, though less widespread than the day before, realizing that the city needed more help, President George H.W. Bush took action. On May 1st, the president activated the federal military to assist. He sent 3,000 to 4,000 U.S. Army soldiers and U.S. Marines, along with about 1,000 federal law enforcement officers, to Los Angeles to support the local police and National Guard. This was a rare occurrence, having U.S. Marines and Army troops patrolling the American cities, as it showed how dire the situation had become. Thanks to the massive influx of troops and the imploring voices calling for calm, by the end of Friday, the worst of the violence had subsided. Many residences, exhausted by 2 days of turmoil, also took King's plea to heart and stayed home if they could. While some fires still burned and some looting and clashes continued after dark, the city was slowly beginning to calm down under the heavy watch of thousands of armed personnel. By Saturday, May the 2nd, Los Angeles was under the grim grip of law enforcement and military presence. The combined forces of the LAPD, the National Guard, and U.S. military were finally getting the upper hand on the unrest. There were convoys of military vehicles driving through the streets and soldiers positioned at major intersections. These forces set up checkpoints and responded swiftly to any sign of trouble. The widespread looting and arson had largely stopped by this point, though isolated incidents still flared up from here and there. Whenever a group tried to gather or a fire was set, troops or police rushed to disperse them. The city looked scarred. Many buildings were burnt out shells, and streets were littered with broken glass and debris from the prior days. But importantly, calm was beginning to prevail. People were finally staying indoors at night, respecting the curfew, because the sight of so many armed personnel and the fear of arrest made most people think twice about being out. The weather also turned rainy on the weekend, which helped to literally dampen the fires and keep people inside. On May the 2nd, President Bush's declaration of Los Angeles as a disaster area became official, which signaled that federal money would be available to help rebuild. Emergency crews and city workers started planning how to clean up the mess. The Los Angeles community, still in shock, was taking stock of the losses. City and state leaders remained cautious. They did not want to declare the crisis over too soon in case violence returned. The curfew was still in effect citywide on Saturday night. Police arrested anyone found looting or breaking the curfew, bringing the total number of arrests into the thousands. By the end of day 4, the situation was much more stable. The worst of the rioting was over thanks to the massive show of force and the pleas for peace from leaders and citizens alike. By Sunday, May the 3rd, Los Angeles was largely peaceful. After several tense days, the city leaders finally signaled the immediate crisis had passed. That morning, Mayor Tom Bradley lifted the citywide curfew, meaning people were allowed to go back onto the street during the evening and night. Many people cautiously ventured out to attending church services or to check on relatives and property. Mayor Bradley had press conferences and announced that the rioting was officially over. There was relief in his voice, but also sadness for what the city had gone through. Throughout Sunday, the city remained under guard, but the atmosphere was different. It was quieter, somber, and people were beginning to help each other. Volunteers started to organize to clean up the streets, sweeping broken glass and picking up debris. Boards went up on shattered windows in some places. Local residents and shop owners, Black, White, Asian, and Latino together, came out with brooms and trash bags to begin the long task of cleaning and rebuilding their neighborhood. There were also peace rallies and prayer gatherings around the city, where community leaders urged Los Angeles to come together and heal. Although the worst of the event was over, some small incidences still occurred on May the 3rd and the next few days. For instance, isolated cases of arson or looting by those who hadn't given up yet, but these were quickly stopped by police or troops. The general feeling was that the storm had passed. After nightfall on Sunday, Los Angeles stayed mostly calm, confirming that lifting the curfew was the right decision. Monday, May 4th, was the first full day of a riot-free Los Angeles. But the city was waking up to the devastation left behind. Schools had been closed during the unrest, and they had subsequently been reopened after. Many businesses and banks also reopened their doors for the first time in nearly a week. Commuters went back to work. It was a strange sight. On the one hand, normal life was resuming. Kids returning to class, buses running, and workers heading downtown. But on the other hand, the scars of the riots were everywhere. In some neighborhoods, nearly every block had a building that was burned to the ground or a shop that was looted and empty. The air still smelled like smoke. National Guard troops and military units, while beginning to withdraw, were still present as a reassuring force and to prevent any new flare-ups. It was calm. With calm restored, official numbers and reports of the riot's impact started to come in. The public learned that dozens of people had lost their lives during the mayhem, and thousands were injured. Emergency aid stations were set up for residents who lost homes or jobs in the fire. Government agencies and community organizations began coordinating relief, food, shelter, and medical care for those affected. There were also efforts to promote dialogue between communities. For example, meetings between Black and Korean community leaders were arranged to mend relations and discuss grievances, recognizing that a lot of healing was needed after the tension and the violence. Even though the active rioting was over, everyone knew that the underlying problems were not solved in 6 days. Monday, May 4th, was a day of reflection in Los Angeles. Many people asked themselves how things had gotten so bad and what needed to change to prevent this from happening again. When the smoke finally cleared, Los Angeles was left to deal with the enormous human and material costs of the riots. The statistics were staggering and underscored how serious this unrest had been. A total of 63 people lost their lives in the riots. These were people of various backgrounds, including rioters, residents, bystanders, and individuals shot by store owners or law enforcement. Among the dead were even several people killed by police or National Guardsmen as they tried to stop the chaos. In addition to the lives, over 2,300 people were reported injured by the end of the riots, ranging from severe gunshot wounds and beating injuries to cuts and smoke inhalation. The authorities arrested more than 12,000 people for riot-related crimes, like looting, assault, arson. Jails in LA were completely overwhelmed, and many of those arrested had been housed in makeshift detention centers. The property damage was historic. An estimated $1 billion worth of property was destroyed. To put it in perspective, entire city blocks were reduced to ashes. Approximately 2,000 to 3,000 businesses were looted, burned, or damaged beyond repair. Many of these were small family-owned shops. It was reported that somewhere around 20,000 to 40,000 businesses and jobs were lost because of so many businesses being wiped out. One community was especially hard hit, Koreatown. Koreatown was a central business district for Korean immigrants just north of South Central LA. It suffered disproportionate shares of destruction. In fact, roughly 45% of all riot damage was estimated to be in Korean-owned businesses, as rioters in many cases specifically targeted Korean shops. This was a devastating blow to the Korean American community. Their economic livelihoods were devastated virtually overnight, with over 1,000 Korean-run stores damaged or destroyed. The outcomes for the Latasha Harlins case were more somber. The store owner, Soon Ja-do, never served prison time for the killing. Judge Joyce Carlin faced intense criticism and protests. Many in the Black community felt she had failed justice. Judge Carlin did not remain on the bench much longer. She stepped down from her position a few years later, partially due to the backlash. Latasha's death, however, was not in vain in terms of awareness. It has since been remembered as a catalyst for improved dialogue. In the aftermath, some Black and Korean community members came together to talk about their grievances and prevent such tragedies from happening again. For the rebuilding efforts, today, the 1992 LA riots are remembered as a tragic chapter, but also a turning point. They led to some police reforms, such as greater oversight of the LAPD and the hiring of more minority officers over time. They also highlighted the need for ongoing work in building trust between law enforcement and communities of color. Every year on the anniversary of the riots, Angelenos remember Latasha Harlins, Rodney King, and all those who suffered, using their stories to educate new generations. While Los Angeles has changed a lot since 1992 with a more diverse police force and stronger community relations, the legacy of the riots remains a powerful cautionary tale about inequity and injustice.